All right, so we all think we know the story of King Arthur, right? But what if the most powerful version of his story isn't a myth at all? What if it's buried in 13th century legal documents and drawn on maps that have been totally erased from history? Today we're going to talk about a King Arthur who didn't just rule Camelot. He ruled an empire at the very top of the world.
So, on one hand, you've got the legend we all know and love, the sword and the stone, the round table, the whole misty English countryside vibe. But then, on the other hand, you have official records. We're talking about an Arctic expedition, an actual empire at the North Pole, and a history that feels like it was deliberately hidden. It's a huge disconnect between what we've been told and what was actually written down.
Okay, so first things first, let's pull back the curtain on the hero himself. We need to look way beyond the Old English legend, because when you do, a much bigger, almost global figure starts to come into focus.
And here's the first clue. Arthur isn't just an English hero. You find these strikingly similar figures popping up all over the world. You know, in Japan, there's a hero named Yamato Takeru. In the Caucasus Mountains, they tell stories of a hero called Batras. You even find these threads in French, Spanish, and Italian sources. Look, that kind of thing doesn't just happen from some tiny local story. It points to something much, much older. A common ancient source that got scattered and retold across the entire globe. Now for the really wild part, the first big piece of physical evidence. For a century and a half, the greatest mapmakers in the world all agreed on what the North Pole looked like. And what they were drawing, it looks nothing like the Arctic we know today.
So this is what they drew. It wasn't a frozen wasteland, that's for sure. It was a very specific geography. 4 large islands, kind of arranged in a circle. Right at the pole, a massive mountain. And in between the islands, these channels of water they called indrawing seas. Currents so powerful, they said ships would get pulled in, with absolutely no hope of escape.
And this wasn't some fluke. We see it on Martin Behaim's globe way back in 1492. We see it on Johannes Ruysch's map from 1508, which even names its source. And, most importantly, on the famous 1569 map by the man himself, Gerardus Mercator. What's incredible is that Mercator's map also had details about North America that weren't officially discovered for another 300 years. So he was obviously working from some very accurate information. And then, suddenly, around the 1630s, poof, it all just vanishes from the maps.
Which leads to the million-dollar question, right? How does an entire continent, a landmass mapped consistently by the best cartographers on Earth for 150 years, just get erased?
Well, the answer, the smoking gun for this whole thing, seems to be hidden in 2 books that have completely disappeared. The only reason we even know about them is because of a few surviving letters written by the most respected mapmaker of the era.
These are the 2 lost sources. The first one was called the Inventio Fortunata, or the Blessed Discovery. It was basically a travel guide, a detailed geographic description of the North Pole. The second was the Gesta Arturi, or the Deeds of Arthur, which was a history book chronicling his military conquests up in that exact same northern region.
Now, in 1577, Gerardus Mercator wrote a letter to the English scholar John Dee explaining exactly where he got his information for those maps. He quotes from a book that cited the Gesta Arturi, and he says that in 530 AD, King Arthur led a military campaign north, conquered the polar islands, and that 4,000 people who entered those indrawing seas were lost forever.
Let's just hang on that number for a second. 4,000 men. That is not the language of myth and fairy tales. Those are casualty reports from a major military operation. This was being described as a real, historical event with absolutely devastating, real-world consequences.
Okay, now this is where the story completely blows up. Because this lost knowledge wasn't just collecting dust in some library. It seems it was being used as a secret guide, at the highest levels of power, to discover new worlds and literally define the borders of empires.
That very same John Dee, the guy who got the letter from Mercator, used the Gesta Arturia to write up a formal legal case for Queen Elizabeth I. His argument was pretty simple. Because King Arthur had conquered Greenland, Iceland, and the islands of the North Pole, England had a prior legal claim to the entire New World. This was politics. This was a legal strategy, not just some old story.
And the trail of this secret book leads somewhere you would never expect. Here's the theory. The Inventio Fortunata, the book with all the geographic details from Arthur's campaign, somehow it got into the hands of Christopher Columbus. Which would mean he didn't just sail west on a hunch, he sailed with a map, a guide to lands that were already known to exist.
And listen, this isn't just speculation. The evidence is pretty compelling. You've got the famous Ottoman Piri Reis map from 1513. It has a note right on it saying Columbus used a book that told him where to go. Columbus's own son wrote a biography that mentioned a specific book his father always carried, but those mentions were quietly edited out of later versions. And get this, in a Spanish archive there's a 1497 letter from a merchant named John Day, and in it he's apologizing because he couldn't find his copy of the Inventio Fortunata.
So let's just try to connect all these dots. We don't have the main books anymore, but what we do have is a shocking amount of secondary evidence, references, letters, maps, all pointing to the same lost history, all just kind of hidden in plain sight in archives all over the world.
I mean, just think about this web of evidence for a second. We've got 13th century English legal texts. We've got Mercator's personal letter. We've got John Dee's formal argument to the Queen of England. We have dozens of maps from different continents, all showing the same lost world. We have testimony from Columbus's own family, notes on an Ottoman admiral's map, and a key letter from some mysterious merchant. They are all pointing in the exact same direction.
And it is so important to get this. We're not talking about some fringe theory from an obscure blog. These are real documents. They're sitting in national archives. The letters are in the British Library. The maps are in major university and museum collections. The evidence is real. It just hasn't been put together like this.
All of which really leaves us with one final, pretty unsettling question. You have a book that describes a lost polar world, that chronicles an ancient king's Arctic empire, and that may have guided Columbus to the New World, and then it suddenly vanishes, along with every map and text that proves it ever existed. It really makes you wonder, was the Inventio Fortunata the most influential and maybe the most successfully suppressed book in all of history?